Jonathan Hickman's X-Men miniseries House of X continues today with issue number 4, and there's a lot of spoilers ahead in this review. Who lives on the X-Men's mission to eliminate Project Orchis? And more importantly, who dies? So, the deaths. There are so many deaths in this issue of House of X number 4, but before getting into that, we have to have the preface. We have to say, importantly, none of these characters will stay dead. I guarantee it. That's my personal comics guarantee. But anyone who's been reading comics for even more than a couple months, mainstream superhero titles, has to know that there's really only one rule in superhero titles about death, and that is only Uncle Ben stays dead. Even Superman's adopted parents, who had been dead for 50 plus years, came back in the 80s, and Ma and Pa Kent were alive again. Uncle Ben, whose death really is the impetus for Spider-Man's origin, is the only one who must stay dead. Everyone else can freely come back, even Bucky. Most of my childhood and into my adulthood, Bucky had been gone for half a century and eventually came back as the Winter Soldier. But these X-Men characters that die in this issue of House of X, guaranteed will come back sooner than 50 years. At the outside, we're looking at 7 years of absence for maybe some of the lesser known characters. Like I'll say M and Husk from Scott Lobdell and Chris Bacalo's Generation X. They might stay dead for a decent amount of time, but even then, I think 7 years would be the longest, and that's just based on the reality of corporate ownership and the trademarks on these characters. If a company like Disney or Marvel wants to retain trademarks and ownership of the characters in that way, they have to use them in publication at least once every 7 years. So they will be back. Don't shed a tear just yet, Professor X, if that is your real name. Don't shed a tear just yet for the death of mutants like M and Husk. They will return, guaranteed. I think it would be good advice for even great writers to remember, like when they're coming on a work for hire title, like the X-Men or Superman or Spider-Man or Batman or anything Marvel or DC publishes ultimately. If you try to make these sorts of lasting changes to the status quo, they just won't stick. It's probably a better idea to tell a compelling story. It's always a better idea to tell a compelling story. And I have enjoyed these miniseries by Hickman, and I think he's telling a compelling story, but I just call them like I see them, and I think these deaths, they're not going to stick, and it really doesn't help the story in any way. As M says to Jean Grey on the other side of the airlock, on the other side of the door in this issue, try harder. Try harder. There's a couple other deaths that probably won't last even as long as Husk and M. When Archangel and Nightcrawler kick the bucket, you can't believe they're going to be gone for long. They got to be coming back. And haven't both of these characters died before? I lose track of how many characters have died in X-Men comics and returned only a year or two later. I forget what the initial death of Kurt Wagner, Nightcrawler, was, but I know it happened, and I know he came back because that was the beginning of Jason Aaron and Ed McGuinness's X-Men run. The X-Men actually went down to like the underworld. It was like some sort of ice realm of hell where there were all these tiny Nightcrawler demons, and they saved his soul. They saved Kurt's soul from hell, which is the other ironic thing in this issue. Nightcrawler's talking to Wolverine and asking him, Logan, are you worried about your soul? Nightcrawler, you should be worried about your soul. The last time you died, you went to hell. How do you know it's not going to happen again? But, he'll probably be fine. Even if he has to spend a couple years down under, he'll be back. They'll rescue him again. I know they will. And with Archangel, what the name says it all, right? He'll be back. He'll be fine. They'll all be fine. And we can also go back to like X-Men history of like where have we seen this sort of stuff before? And I think it all goes back originally to Jean Grey, the Phoenix, dying in 1980 at that point, that was editorial mandate. Jim Shooter said, look, she has done all these crimes. She destroyed a planet. It has to result in her death. She has to die for these crimes. There has to be consequences here. And those consequences stuck for a decent amount of time in terms of comic book deaths. She stayed dead for almost half a decade. So she died in, Uncanny X-Men 137, 138. And then She came back near the end of John Byrne's Fantastic Four run, thanks to an idea, I think that was sent in by Kurt Busiek. As a fan, he sent a letter like, here's an idea for how you could bring Jean back. Actually, the Phoenix wasn't Jean. She was in Jamaica Bay in a pod, in a stasis pod, the whole time. That's how you bring her back. And editorial was like, oh, perfect. Exactly what we need, because the trademark's about to run out and we need to put her on the X Factor team. Which was, that was actually, it wasn't even for the sake of telling a good story. It actually ended up ruining a character for a decent amount of time until they undid the consequences for Scott Summers. Because if you were reading X-Men at the time, or you went back and read those Claremont issues later, you realize like Scott had moved on. It was kind of weird that he married a woman that looked just like his ex-girlfriend. He married Madeline Pryor, looked just like Jean Grey. But they had a kid together. Everything seemed hunky-dory. It turned out, later she was a genetic clone, a project of Mr. Sinister, and who created the Goblin Queen, and that was the whole Inferno crossover. But at the time, it was just like, this is Scott's retirement plan. But none of these characters can stay retired. None of these characters can ultimately die. They got to come back. They got to be an X Factor or whatever it's going to be. So Archangel will be back, Nightcrawler will be back, M will be back, Husk will be back. Don't even worry about it. There's still some other questions in this book, though, in this story, that I'm unsure about. People keep telling me, and I think they might have mentioned the story, that this is Professor X with the big helmet. And I thought from the beginning, even as the single tear rolls down his cheek, no more. We can't have any more deaths for mutants. I was just thinking, I thought this was the Maker. I thought this was Ultimate Reed Richards with the helmet, but maybe it is Professor X. So the other thing is, another difference in status quo, why is he standing? Why is he able to walk? As we all know, Professor X in the status quo is most often in a wheelchair, so why not here? But that's another one of those things that every once in a while, every couple of years, for a dozen, 24, 50 issues, Professor X can walk. But then someone breaks his back again. Unfortunate. But this is just the status quo. We'll always have the most familiar forms of these characters. That is both the blessing and the curse of corporate-owned characters like the X-Men. It's just something we have to be aware of as fans. Sometimes, of course, the status quo, its familiarity, is, of course, also appealing to us. And an example of that is the costume I'm doing here for Marvel Girl Jean Grey, like the classic X-Men uniform that I think always looked its best in those Jim Lee Shi'ar issues, Chris Claremont writing Uncanny 273 to 277. Those were great issues, great costumes for the X-Men. And I really think that's what Jorge Molina is drawing from when he's doing the variant covers for these new miniseries, House of X and Powers of 10. That's also, I want to give him credit, that's what I'm referencing here for this Jean Grey drawing. Fans love nostalgia. Fans love the things that are familiar to them, and sometimes that's great. Sometimes it results in some fantastic art, in some fantastic books, but I don't think anyone is having the wool pulled over their eyes in terms of these X-Men staying dead. Another interesting thing about X-Men not staying dead or always returning to the status quo is, if you remember back in the 90s when Wolverine had his adamantium ripped from his body in X-Men 25, and then the follow-up to that story where he leaves the X-Men in Wolverine 75. It seemed like they were leading up to Wolverine 100 at the time, always going to get the adamantium back. That was kind of an interesting story because it was at least like a bait and switch, and he started going more feral. But even then, flash forward to Wolverine 145, I think, with Eric Larson writing, he gets it back. He becomes a horseman of apocalypse, not for long. He's just death for a little bit. But he becomes the Wolverine we all know and love again, because you can't stick with the feral, no-nose Wolverine. You can't stick with Charles Xavier walking around, and you can't stick with Nightcrawler and Archangel and Husk and M all 6 feet under. It's just not going to work, and they will come back. Final thing I'll mention about this issue of House of X is the chart in there talking about all the characters who have caused mutants irreparable harm by murder and destruction and killing all these mutants. And I think it was kind of rude they put Wanda Maximoff on the list. For splitting hairs here, she didn't really kill the mutants, but she did remove their mutant genes. This was, again, the House of M crossover from 2005 and the follow-up Decimation, where Wanda said, no more mutants, and it became done. Snap, just like that. It's her hex powers at work. Always kind of unsure exactly how those hex powers worked, if they could just do basically anything the plot demands. But she did apologize for it later, and everyone got their powers back. So should she really be on the same list as Graydon Creed and Cameron Hodge and, you know, the big bad here, Bolivar Trask with the Sentinels, who killed 16 million plus? Just seems kind of cruel. And I forget, we go back and forth on whether Wanda is a mutant herself, her and Quicksilver. Are they mutants? Are they the daughter and son of Magneto? It's just, that's kind of a story point that I'm not sure if there is like a status quo we always stick with. But I want to go out on a high note here. I want to say again, I am enjoying this book. I'm going to keep reading. Let me know in the comments if you're still enjoying Hickman's run and you're going to keep reading. I'm really, really loving it. I'm becoming a huge fan of Pepe Larraz. I'm doing like a Wolverine based on his art here too, with the Jorge Molina Jean Grey. So just loving that stuff. I'm going to come back for the art #1 and the writing #2, to be honest. But until next time, if you enjoyed this video, smash that like button, subscribe to the channel, please. Tap the bell for notifications. And if you're an artist yourself, feel free to share something with me. And remember, if you want to become a better artist, the only way to do it is to keep drawing. So all the artists out there, draw every day. Keep drawing, and I'll see you next time.